Bill is passed.
My life starts tomorrow in terms of my legal rights. I am delighted. I never thought I'd see this day.
A landmark law passed this week by the U.S. Congress has once again shown that Americans with disabilities have real political clout, unlike their counterparts in Canada. Hello and welcome to DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin. Susan is on assignment this week. The U.S. House of Representatives approved landmark legislation this week that will guarantee equal access and civil rights protection for millions of Americans with disabilities. Still, some AIDS activists are worried about one provision. We have this report by Linda Tyra of CBS News.
Because the House chamber is not equipped to accommodate all their wheelchairs, these disabled visitors to the Capitol had to witness their victory on television. But that touch of irony didn't temper their joy.
My life starts tomorrow in terms of my legal rights. I am delighted. I never thought I'd see this day.
The bill, passed by an overwhelming vote of 403 to 20, extends for the first time specific federal protections to the 43 million Americans with mental and physical disabilities.
It was not just 43 million Americans who won today. Every American won today.
The bill picks up where the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 left off, banning discrimination against the disabled in employment, telephone services, public accommodations, and transportation. It's designed to remove barriers for people like Andrew Goodyear, who works as a commercial real estate analyst.
If no one's around, then you're basically stuck. Would you mind grabbing the door for me? You can't go where you want to go. Simple things such as, putting a lever handle on a door or widening an area would go a long way. If employers will make the effort, I think there's a great work source of people that they're missing out on.
But business interests fear the bill is a good idea gone bad. They aren't sure what must be done to make, in the words of the bill, reasonable accommodations for the disabled.
We're concerned that the wording is vague. It's going to lead to a lot of unnecessary legal action.
I'm getting calls from my members, a small business out in Podunk, Iowa, and they're saying, am I going to have to do this?
The White House backs the legislation, but before final passage, one controversial difference must be ironed out with the Senate-passed bill, an amendment in the House allowing businesses to transfer people with AIDS out of food handling jobs. Linda Tyra, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
Up until now, Americans who have disabilities have depended on a patchwork of laws and the goodwill of others to incorporate them into the mainstream. Two-thirds of them are unemployed, largely because society is not accessible. Here are 5 major provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which should change that situation. Employment. Employers of 15 or more people are required to make reasonable accommodations, such as lowering a desk or establishing a flexible work schedule so a person with a disability can perform the job. Public accommodations. Service to a disabled person cannot be refused. New buildings and buildings under major renovation must be accessible. Where readily achievable, existing buildings must remove barriers by building a ramp or installing grab bars. Transportation. New public buses must have wheelchair lifts. Private bus companies must ensure accessibility within 6 years. New rail facilities and all new train cars must be accessible. 1 car per commuter, light rail, or Amtrak train must be accessible within 5 years. Telecommunications. Special equipment must be made available for those with hearing and speech impairments. Remedies. In cases where the Attorney General sees a practice of discrimination, fines of $50,000 for the first violation and $100,000 for subsequent ones may be imposed. Joining us now from Washington is Jay Rockland. He's the Executive Director of the President's Committee on Employment for People with Disabilities. He was one of the key players in getting the bill through the U.S. Congress. Mr. Rockland, you must be very excited by the bill, are you not?
Yes, we are, and I am too. It's been an exciting day in Washington, and we're excited about the prospect that this presents to make Americans with disabilities full partners in our society.
Who made this bill happen? Was it just the politicians, or did the consumer groups have anything to do with this as well?
No, consumer groups had a great deal to do with it. The bill was conceived by the National Council on Disability, a 15-member organization appointed by the President and confirmed by the Congress. And in 1986, they presented a report called Towards Independence. It was given to the President and the Congress, and it cited the needs of Americans with disabilities, and one of those was the need for comprehensive civil rights legislation. Once that was presented, the National Council took the initial steps to draft a bill, and all of the disability groups, and there was a tremendous effort made throughout our country, and probably one of the greatest examples of coalition building. And it has been a marvelous effort of groups at the grassroots and at the national level, working with the Congress to see that this legislation did in fact become a reality.
Americans appear to enjoy a host of protections under your Constitution. Why a special bill for people with disabilities?
Well, people with disabilities have been discriminated against for years and years. And we have 43 million Americans with disabilities. And the discrimination was first recognized in the 70s when our Rehabilitation Act was passed, which provided some coverage, but primarily involved, as far as employment went, contractors of the federal government and recipients of federal funds. But this bill now extends equality and independence to all Americans with disabilities, and hopefully will make the discriminatory practices of the past just that, something of the past.
What types of political support has there been for the bill?
There's been excellent political support. It has been bipartisan political support. There have been people on both sides of our aisle, Republican and Democrats, in both the Senate and the House. The President endorsed the bill and has been waiting anxiously for the House passage so that he can have a bill to sign, and it has truly been a bipartisan effort.
Well, with all the support that we've seen, there's got to be some opposition. Who is opposing the bill? Or who opposed the bill?
Well, there was some opposition by the transportation industry. There was some opposition by the business community. Many of the issues that the business community brought forward in the initial bill were addressed in some compromises that were worked out between the Senate, our Senate, and the administration. And we think we now have a bill that is fair to all.
What types of, enforcement mechanisms are in place?
Yes, there are enforcement mechanisms under each of the provisions because, quite frankly, rights without remedies are really no rights at all. Under the employment provision, the same remedies that exist under our Civil Rights Act of 1964 will apply under the employment provision. The Attorney General will provide enforcement for the public accommodations provision. The Federal Communications Commission will provide enforcement for the communications provisions, and the Department of Transportation for the transportation provisions.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Joining us now from Winnipeg are Laurie Weisbold and Yvonne Peters. Weisbold is the national coordinator of COPO, the Coalition of Provincial Organizations of the Handicapped. Peters is the national coordinator of the Canadian Disability Rights Council. Ms. Peters, does Canada need a Disabilities Act like the United States does?
We have a similar version of the Civil Rights Bill, which is what our friends in the States have through our charter guarantees. What we don't have is the teeth, the enforcement to make sure that those equality rights are acted on and recognized. So clearly it would be very useful for us to have some kind of mechanism, not necessarily the same kind as we see in the States, but something similar that would put teeth into equality rights, make them a reality. So I really do think that there's some interesting things to look at that are going on in the States.
Mr. Beachell, do you think that the American mechanism could be used as a blueprint here in Canada?
Well, I think we can use the experience of the disabled colleagues in the U.S. As a blueprint here in Canada. I think we have to recognize that we are somewhat different in our relationships between federal and provincial governments, and that we will have to take those relationships into account. For most disabled people, services are delivered locally and initiated by provincial governments. What we need from our federal government is a collaboration with the provinces to set some national standards in a variety of service areas. I would have to say that that presently looks somewhat unhopeful with the present relations between federal and provincial governments. But yes, the excitement around the bill, the attempt to get the enforcement mechanism from the states, I think we can use the American model and implement some of that kind of action here in Canada.
Ms. Peters, do you think that there is a political will, the political will in this country to bring this type of legislation forward?
Well, we've been hearing noises that some of the politicians have actually traveled down to Washington to talk to some of the folk who have been involved in bringing about this legislation. They're interested in how it is working, what it might mean to Canada. So I do think that there is some interest. How widespread that interest is, of course, I really can't say, but I think that we're being encouraged, at least, that we need to talk about this and look at what a Canadian version would look like.
Thank you very much. We'll be speaking to you later in the show. You do see people with disabilities at the big political events, such as last year's NDP Leadership Convention. But rarely do the needs and concerns of people with disabilities capture the attention of our political leaders, whatever the party. The politicians openly court other groups, visible minorities, Native people, women, but seldom does the word disabled pass their lips. With us once again are Laurie Beachell and Yvonne Peters. Mr. Beachell, do you think the politicians and the top politicians in Canada ignore people with disabilities?
I don't believe they ignore people with disabilities or the issues. I would say that they have not made a number of the issues a priority, where we have pieces of legislation like the Employment Equity Act that are supposedly affirmative action programs for disabled persons. We see very little in the way of results. Legislation and promises, but little in the way of enforcement mechanisms or regulations in law that make substantive differences for people and their lives. We have seen improvements in legislation in the area of transportation in this country, but we have not seen yet one bus running across Canada that is accessible to anyone who uses a wheelchair. I would have to say that the Canadian Human Rights Act, which holds great promise, we had a defeat in the courts of 5 years ago and a promise from the federal government to amend the legislation to ensure protection for disabled Canadians. Yet we have seen no introduction of that legislation into the House of Commons yet. While no politician wishes to appear to not support disabled persons' issues, we have few politicians that are willing to put disabled persons' issues as a priority and to ensure some action upon those issues.
Ms. Peters, why do you think we've seen so little progress? Why do you think this is?
Well, I think that primarily it's due to the fact that people with disabilities don't hold a great deal of power in the vote. So while it is a nice, almost motherhood and apple pie issue to pay lip service to, I don't think they have seen us as the strong contingency or strong force that perhaps other interest groups have been. And for this reason, I think what we have seen is lip service promises, that sort of thing, but not the teeth that is needed to actually make real meaningful changes in disabled people's lives.
Again to you, Ms. Peters, do you think that the politicians are to blame for this?
Well, certainly, I mean, they have led us to believe that they hear us. And by that I mean they supported and proclaimed the equality rights of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which gives people with disabilities constitutional recognition of their rights. So they lead us to believe that they hear us, but then they turn around and they do not put the teeth into those rights that would make it meaningful and real. And I think, I do think that we're just not at this point on the political agenda. I'm not sure whose exact fault that is, but I don't think it's from lack of trying on the part of disabled people. We've witnessed numerous reports outlining what changes have to be made. We've met with politicians, we've appeared before committees, and yet we still don't see those real changes that have to be made for equality to be realized.
Mr. Beachell, is it possible that the politicians know the issues but believe that there are no votes in talking about them?
I think some politicians don't recognize the vote that is there. Disability not only affects persons with a disability, but their family members as well. And if you look at the incidence of disability within the population, it is a significant block. So I would say politicians don't recognize, they also assume that the old traditional ways of providing service will meet most of the needs of disabled Canadians. And that is that the charity organizations and the service organizations that were set up and supported by donated dollars somehow meet the needs. To us, we are opposed to that type of process. We would rather see and insist upon our rights being ensured and that services be provided to disabled citizens as to any citizen within the country.
Ms. Peters, how much political clout do people with disabilities really have in this country?
Well, I'd like to believe that we have a lot of political clout. I think, as my colleague has said, disability affects all classes, all races, all ages, that disability is a consequence of our society, and I would hope that we have a lot of political clout. It's just, how do we convince the politicians that we are a priority and that we have to be on the political agenda? And I think this is where we can take, hopefully, some guidance and draw some lessons from our colleagues to the south of us who've managed to get on the political agenda in the United States. And I think this shows us that it can be done, and we simply need to do that here in Canada.
Ms. Peters and Mr. Beachell, we're running out of time, so I would like to thank you both for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching DNET, the Disability Network. This is a tube of lipstick, and not mine, I should add quickly. And this is a cylinder of styrofoam. Put the two together, voila, you have created an assistive device for someone with limited finger movement. It belongs to Laurie Weisbold. Weisbold is an example of someone who did not let their disability defeat them. She has started her own business as a cosmetician. Susan spoke with her earlier this week.
Laurie, what inspired you to set up your service Looks by Laurie?
Well, what basically happened, in 1978, I was 18 years old and I was diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis. In 1981, I started my cosmetic career, and that lasted till about 1988. My arthritis had progressed to such an extent that I could no longer stand on my feet for 8 hours a day. So I was forced basically to give up my cosmetic career. After about a year of thinking about it, decided that I did not want to give up cosmetics. I decided to use my experience as a cosmetician and esthetician and my background with my own experiences with my disabilities from arthritis to form a cosmetic consulting service to aid individuals who have trouble servicing their own cosmetic needs. And that's basically how I started Looks by Laurie.
That's great. What does the service provide to the disabled population?
Basically what I do is makeup application, facials, color analysis, skincare analysis, and I provide an in-home shopping service for people who are permanently disabled, temporarily disabled, the seeing impaired, the elderly, and anybody who's infirmed in their own homes. My service is an in-home and in-hospital service.
What about the cosmetic industry itself? We've talked a little bit about how inaccessible that is. Can you talk talk a little bit about the barriers that one would, incur?
Okay, as I said before, that I was in the cosmetic industry for roughly 6 years. During that time, I worked in 3 major department stores within the city of Toronto. During those years, I think I serviced one person only once who was in a wheelchair. I found that the cosmetic departments were not wheelchair accessible. The counters were about 2.5 feet too high for somebody in a wheelchair to see any of the makeup or the skincare products. I also found that the majority of cosmeticians were inexperienced in dealing with the disabled and their specific needs. They weren't trained in this area. Eventually, what I would like to do is develop a program to train people, to train cosmeticians to service the disabled community.
You've brought along some interesting tools here to help the disabled. Also, perhaps you could describe to me what you have here. Let's start with these little handles.
Basically what these are foam attachments that go on the end of cosmetic brushes. They facilitate a more easy grasp for people who have limited hand function. Not only can they be used on makeup brushes, but they can be used on cutlery, on pens, pencils, anything where a person might have difficulty in grasping an object. What I do is go to my clients' homes. I will fit their makeup brushes or their cutlery, whatever they need fitted with these products, and basically it makes it easier on a daily use for them. I also have on some of my products a product called Dysim.
Is this blue product?
Yes, it is. What that does, it can be attached to bottles and jars, and it also makes it easier for my client to open up the bottles and the jars. And I also.
Why is that? Could you describe the texture?
It's a non-slip texture.
Yeah, so you get a better grip.
Better grip. Mm-hmm.
That's good. Why is self-image and appearance so important, not only for the disabled, but the abled population?
Of course, self-image is very important to everybody. What I found through my own experiences over the past 12 years with my arthritis, there were times when my self-image really took a beating. I found, though, that maintaining my appearance, meaning my hair, my nails, my makeup, and my skin, that I was able to sort of maintain a positive self-image. And in the long run, what that did is really enhance the quality of my life. I feel that everybody deserves the right to look good. If they can't do it themselves, and I understand that independence is very important, that's the first priority, but definitely should get a professional to help them do it, because maintaining a positive self-image is very important, especially if you have a disability.
Laurie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Susan.
If you know of any entrepreneurial success stories, please let us know. We'll give you our address after the commercial break. So get those pens and braillers ready. And that's our show for this week. Susan is on assignment in London, Ontario. She is covering a major conference on attendant care, a topic of crucial importance to many people with disabilities. We get lots of letters from people across the country, and we want to encourage you to keep writing us. And if you want to write to us at DNet, our address is the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, M5W 1E6. And our fax numbers for those folks who have a fax, our area code is 416-975-5636. I'm Joe Coughlin. See you again next week.